This conference will now be recorded.
Thanks, Josh. Good morning, everybody. So, yes, as Josh said, I'm going to talk this morning about shadows. This is a bit of an elaboration on a talk I did at Bible school, and I was thinking to myself when I got here, oh, well, there'll be a lot of people that weren't at Bible school anyway, so this would be an opportunity. And then at about 5 to 11, I looked around and I thought, everybody here was at Bible school. But fortunately, afterwards, a whole lot turned up that weren't at Bible school. So for those who were at Bible school, this is a little bit of a rehash of something I did, but developing on a theme. So shadows, we've obviously all got them, and I don't know about you, but when I was young, this is kind of something when you're young and you're thinking about shadows, you know, liking to sleep with the light on at night. Because at night, of course, you know, the moonlight casts shadows into your room, and shadows can be quite terrifying, can't they? Maybe some of you still sleep with the light on at the moment. So shadows can be very scary because shadows present images of things which might not be real, but they can be very real in our imagination. So something is cast there in a shadow, and then our minds run away with what that might be. So what is a simple shadow, which might just be a reflection of a tree, suddenly becomes a monster. And of course, people can be afraid of their own shadow. And this kind of builds upon what we looked at in our camp that we had last week, where we were looking at the subject of resentment. And resentment comes from things which happen in our past, which become daunting shadows in our lives. And it's the journey that all of us need to really go on in the path from remorse, regret, resentment, into rebirth, regeneration, rejoicing. And so facing our own shadows can be a terrifying experience. I mean, lots of people are afraid of their shadows. Even animals can be afraid of their shadows. And, you know, here's a couple of animals that are dealing with their shadows. They're trying to attack their shadow that seems to be following them wherever they go. So this exhortation is about facing your shadows, the shadows of your past. In the Old Testament, the subject of shadows appears a lot in the Hebrew, and it's used in 3 different ways. The first way is actually quite a positive way. It's the idea of protection. You might have think about the quote, abiding under the shadow of his wings. The idea of coming into the shadow of a house. This is the idea of being protected. Only this morning I took the dogs for a walk. It was quite bright in the sun, and Honey went and lay down deep underneath a tree, and I was going to take a picture and put it up there because she was hiding in the shadows of the tree because she probably needs a haircut and it was very hot. But that's the idea, protection from heat or protection. We think about the story of Jonah. That's a great story, isn't it? He dwelt under the shadow of the good to be protected from the heat of the sun. So this idea of shadows is really good. And so this quote, of course, in that this idea of dwelling under the shadow of the wings comes from Psalm 91, but it also has a wonderful picture of the cherubim, because the shadow of the wings were like the cherubim which reached over the ark and symbolized God's presence. And Israel dwelt under the shadow of God's presence. So that's one way the Bible, the Old Testament, uses the idea of shadows. The other is the idea of the transitory nature of our lives, the shadow that passes, the shadow that starts when we're young and when we come to, full life, and then slowly as we move on to the end of our life, our shadow draws longer in the day. And it's a symbol of death. So that's kind of the two ways that the shadow is used in the Old Testament. The third way combines both of these ideas, and it's actually one Hebrew word which is used, and it's the word samavas, and it's a combination of the word for shadow and death, and it's made into one Hebrew word. And that's looking at that end point. So when we look at the shadow as a transitory thing through the Old Testament, it talks about the transitory of life. My life is like a shadow. But when we get this subject, and it appears a lot in the Old Testament through the Psalms and through Job, and it talks about the shadow of death, it's talking about one point in life, that end point, that finality of mortality. And Psalm 23 is a beautiful psalm that we read because it picks up both aspects of the idea of shadow in the sense of protection, and then the shadow of death. So that verse in Psalm 23, for instance, it says, even though I walk through the shadow of death, that's that one word, I will fear no evil, for you are with me, your rod and your staff comfort me. So this is the shadow of protection that is with David as he's writing about facing the shadow of death, being able to confront the shadow of death because he's under the protection or shadow of God. So there's a psalm where both ideas are being used for that same word. We are, of course, at that time of Passover, and Passover was very much that same story. Of course, the story of Passover was about the story when the children of Israel painted their houses with blood so that their houses might be protected, so that God would overshadow them and protect them and keep them safe from the angel of death. And this is a very famous painting that that is here from, it was a carving actually from 1897, and I think it's in a French museum. But this shows a picture of a winged angel. But the shadow of the angel being cast over the door of the house as it inspects the house. Can you imagine? I'm thinking about back in that day, that first Passover. Imagine the kids out there, and they're asking the question, why did the lamb have to die? Why did we have to kill that lamb? We've had it in our house for 7 days. It would have been quite a traumatic experience for kids. And then what are you doing with the blood? Yeah. Like they're painting the blood over their doors. It's like, yuck, why would you do that? Then in the middle of the night, can you imagine when the screams were heard right through Egypt? It would have been a terrifying night. And all of a sudden the kids would be like, what's that? And that's God bringing judgment on Egypt. And they'd be like, are we safe? We're safe because we've got blood on our doors. Did we put enough on? What if it can't be seen? What if it's dried out? You know, that screams would have been terrifying for those kids. So all of a sudden, you know, their protection under the blood of that lamb became something that they had to trust in. So in Hebrews, it says of Jesus that he set free, in Hebrews chapter 2, verse 15, all those who I can't quite see it. quotes. I will look up. Hebrews 2, verse 15. So it says, verse 14, since therefore children share in flesh and blood, he himself likewise took part of the same, that through death he might destroy the one who has power of death, that is the devil, and deliver all of those who through fear of death were subject to lifelong slavery. Who through fear of death, that's the word thanatophobia. Thanos is the god of death in the Greek. So Thanos means death. Obviously, phobia means fear of death. So he's come to deliver those who for their entire life were subject to slavery through fear of death. So in order to paint this picture of our life in terms of our relationship to Jesus, who helps us to overcome regret, remorse, resentment, and helps us to go through this transition to be able to be restored, reborn, regenerated. I want to look at two examples, one from the Old Testament and one from the New Testament. That hasn't shown up so well. So this is Saul here, and it should say Saul there. So I can't even see that. Oh, there you go. I'll turn the light on. So Saul, of course, cast a huge shadow. I can't see my notes on here. He cast a. Oh, it's all right. It's all right. We'll just run it. I know that you guys are familiar with this. So the thing with Saul was the people wanted a king. And so God selected Saul, and it says of Saul that he was head and shoulders above every man in the army. So he cast a big shadow. When you saw Saul, the shadow he cast was bigger than anybody else. He was bigger, taller, he was better looking, he was a very powerful king. So that's the thing with Saul. He was a very tall, powerful, prominent man who cast a great shadow. And when he started, he was very faithful, of course. I just got to go here. Something's going. Oh, I've got a quote here that's not appearing, but I can't even read this because it's behind like the background. Can we change the background? Sorry. The problem when you your presentation is your notes. Yeah. Instead of the black background. It's taken over all my slides.
How can we we can edit it quickly. I can exit and edit it.
Look, let's just go with it. That's right. Okay. Someone can tell me then where this quote comes from, because it was on my slide and I haven't got it on my notes. But God says of Saul, when you were small, he was of, when God called Saul, Saul says, I am of the smallest of the tribes of Israel, and I am the least in my family's, in my clan. Anyone know where that one comes from? I've got the quote, and I can find it. Sounds familiar. 1 Samuel 9:21. There, brilliant. Thank you, Andrew. Saul answered and says, am I not a Benjamite from the least of the tribes of Israel? And isn't my clan the humblest of all the clans of Israel? Why have you spoken to me this way? So when God called Saul, this tall man who cast a big shadow, he was a big, tall man. He says, I come from the least tribe, the smallest tribe in Israel, Benjamin. We're the smallest tribe. And my family are least, the smallest in this clan. So I'm the least of the least. I'm very small. Why did you call me? How come you've called me to this great position? Now that's how Saul was called. When the kingdom was rent from him, and I think it's in chapter 15, thank you, Jackie. Samuel says to Saul, though you are little in your own eyes, are you not head of the tribes of Israel? In fact, we should go back. Verse 16. Samuel said to Saul, stop, I'll tell you what the Lord has said to me. He said, speak. Samuel said, though you are little in your own eyes, are you not the head of the tribes of Israel? And the Lord anointed him king. Sorry, that's not the one I was looking for, but that's interesting. When he was little in his own eyes, God anointed him king. And then later, Samuel, of course, became big. Saul became big in his own eyes. He started to act without listening to God. He started to do things without God's command. And Samuel said, your kingdom shall be rent from you because of this. Because when you were least in your own eyes, then you were great. But now, Saul became great in his own eyes. When suddenly Saul became big, that's when the kingdom was rent from him. And so what happened to Saul after this, of course, is a shadow of gloom came on Saul. He began to go through, after the kingdom was taken from him, that process of resentment, that re-feeling of these emotions, of failure, regret, remorse. And it ate at him. It continued to eat at him. And as we learned last week, the reaction to that, Mother Ben told us, is that often that reaction comes out in judgment. And look what he did to David. So it's a classic example of how this resentment and remorse and regret made him transgress more and more and more, because he ended up in self-loathing, melancholy. We see these great, fits of depression that Saul was under because he couldn't cope with God's rejection and he couldn't cope with failure. Now, the second person I wanted to look at is in the New Testament. And his name is also Saul. And we're first introduced to him in Acts chapter 7. Sorry, we're first introduced to this other Saul at the story of the stoning of Stephen. And in verse 58, they cast Stephen out of the city and they stoned him, and witnesses laid down their garments at the feet of a young man called Saul. And as they were stoning Stephen, he cried out, Lord Jesus, receive my spirit. And so now we are introduced into the New Testament to another Saul. And guess what? We just read in Philippians chapter 3 of the stock of Saul, where he came from, his background. He said in Philippians chapter 3 that in verse 5, he says, if anyone thinks he has reason of confidence of the flesh, I more, circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, I'm a Hebrew of the Hebrews. So here's another Saul from Benjamin. Same name, probably named after King Saul. And it says of this man that he was a persecutor of the church. You know what it says of Benjamin in Genesis 49 in the prophecy of Jacob? It says, Benjamin shall raven as a wolf in the morning and shall devour the prey at night and shall divide the spoil. There is no scarier shadow. No scarier shadow. Movies are made about this shadow. There's nothing scarier than a wolf in the night on the prowl. And Benjamin shall raven as a wolf. And let me tell you that Saul of Tarsus was a terrifying person. His background was that he was a persecutor of the first century ecclesia. Imagine being part of that first century ecclesia, the most terrifying name out there. Enemy number one of the first century ecclesia was Saul. He was scary. He dragged people out of their homes. He had them beaten. He had them flogged. He brought them before the council. He was so fiery. And he was there at the stoning of Stephen. He was guilty of the blood, the murder of Stephen. And this wolf ravaged at night until he came face to face with brilliant light. And what happens when darkness meets light? And here you find Saul came face to face with the Lord Jesus Christ in the brightness of the day. In 1 John 2, it says, the one who hates his brother walks in darkness. He does not know where he's going because darkness has blinded his eyes. And he came face to face with this brilliant light. And this man who had been a persecutor, a hater of the brethren, was suddenly blinded. And in a moment, the wolf disappears. Oh, that's not very sharp. And then down here, Saul becomes Paul. And what we find out about that is we don't know who changed his name. We have no record of whether this was God's call, like Jesus changed the names of many of the disciples. It would seem that it was Paul that changed his name. Changed his name from Saul to Paul. Because what does Paul mean? Little. Little. Remember the first Saul? When you were little, then you were great. And Paul says, you want to ask about my credentials in the flesh? I am circumcised the 8th day. I am of the tribe of Benjamin. I am a Hebrew of the Hebrews. I am a Pharisee. And then he'll go on to say, and I am nothing as that. But he gives his earthly credentials and says, from a Jewish perspective, I have all the credentials. But he changes his name from Saul to Paul. And look what happens as he goes through. Oh, dear. No, it's there. It's there. yeah, we can do that. We can do that. We can do that. So as you go through Paul's life, you see this progression. So he starts here in 1 Corinthians. This is one of his earliest epistles. And he says there, for I am the least of the apostles and not meet to be called an apostle because I persecuted the ecclesia of God. So you see how he's haunted. He is haunted by what he's done. In his life, he has this huge shadow over him that he is guilty of murder. He would go and fellowship with people in a meeting where people would be there and look at him and say, he's the guy that had my aunt beaten. He's the guy that dragged out my brother before the council. It was because of him that Stephen was stoned to death. You imagine that? He would go in and fellowship with people that he'd know that he was directly responsible. How do you deal with that? How do you cope with that background? Well, he says, I am least of the apostles. I'm the smallest of all the apostles. But you know what? The apostles were pretty great. Because what it says in Acts chapter 5, it says, when they carried out the sick and laid them at the cots and pallets, so that Peter came by, if his shadow might fall on some of them, they'd be healed. They'd bring out all their sick just to be able to have Peter's shadow fall on. That's the idea of the shadow of protection, shadow of love. So that's how great the apostles were, that if you could just get in their shadow, it would be a good thing. And Paul says, well, I'm the least of the apostles. But that still makes them pretty great. Still makes them pretty amazing. So he goes on. And in Ephesians, another later writing, he says, unto me, this is easy to read, isn't it? You can all see that. I can see it from here. It's clear as crystal. Unto me, who is less than the least of the saints, is this grace given so that I should preach among the Gentiles the unsearchable riches of Christ. So now he says, I'm less than the least of all saints. Now you would think as you're reading that, this guy has got so much problem with dealing in his past. You know, his shadow is haunting him so bad, he's falling into the situation of Saul. He's getting deeper and deeper into remorse, regret, resentment. Well, it gets bigger than that. His shadow becomes so big. In 1 Timothy, one of his last epistles, he says, this is a faithful saying and worthy of all acceptation, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the greatest. So now he's the greatest. The greatest sinner ever. Imagine saying that. I'm the greatest sinner ever. That's something to boast about, isn't it? And in all this, you see Paul's shadow is huge in his life. But what we read in Philippians chapter 3 is this incredible confidence of Paul. Though he has all of this, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. Forgetting those things which are behind, I press forward to the mark. So how does he deal with this shadow? At the end of his life, he turns around and says, there's a crown of righteousness laid up for me. He is so utterly confident, isn't he? He's completely confident of his salvation. Imagine that. When you come to the end of your life, people often think, even my mum, when she was dying of cancer, was like, I just don't know whether I'm worthy or good enough. And you think back in your life, and she's like, you know, I like to play tennis and I played bowls. I'm not sure if I'm good enough because of the things that I used to enjoy. It's like, huh? The Apostle Paul, well, he used to kill people. That's what he did. He beat people. He killed people. Imagine dealing with that background and being utterly confident of your salvation. None of us are worthy. And we all have this treasure in earthen vessels. And the thing is, our shadows are not a true representation of what we are. Shadows might actually be telling lies. It might not represent what we are at all. In this case, these shadows appear to be a girl grabbing a chimpanzee by the tail. But as you can see, that's not exactly what the real picture is. And the lesson we learn from shadows is this. Our shadow really does not define who we are right now. Our shadow is often a poor reflection of what may have been in the past. And so those things in the past, like Paul says, forgetting those things which are behind. He had to. If he dwelt on those things, and if he dwelt on his failure, Paul would never have been the man he was. He had to forget those things which are behind. Even though he would go and sit in the same room with people that he had hurt and persecuted, he had to forgive himself because he knew he had been forgiven. And as we grow older, our shadow does grow bigger. You know, when we think about our life as we get older, we do realize how insignificant our entire lives are. And that's why people, you know, on their deathbed have regrets, have remorse, because the things that they ought to have valued the most, they didn't. Things like family and friends. And they made issues of things that they shouldn't have done. And people want to have these deathbed repentances for their families. Because we suddenly realize, you know, our lifespan is nothing. So our shadow does grow bigger as the day draws to a close. But as it draws to a close, our shadow also becomes distorted. It becomes less and less of a reflection of who we are at the end of our life. It ought to be completely distorted. Just a passing thing. And the biggest point in all of this, and this is the true lesson of shadows, is that if we're facing the light, we can't see our shadow. And that's what Paul means. We have to turn to the light. This is the day, isn't it, of the resurrection morn. This is the Passover, the first day of the week, the day when the darkness of death was overcome by one man. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. The people living in the sphere of the shadow of death have seen a great light. Because Jesus isn't in there. He's not in a dark tomb. There's nobody in there. There's somebody in here. He's broken the bonds of death. He's broken the fear of death that all of us have. And in him is light. And in him is the overcoming of all our shadows, of all our past, of all our regrets. Here is rebirth. Here is regeneration. Here is reigniting. So we come to remember our risen Lord.